The Bermuda Triangle didn't begin with a scientific discovery. It began with a story. In 1950, an article appeared in several American newspapers. It brought together 5 separate disappearances from the previous few years. 1 boat, 9 planes, and around 135 passengers and crew members had vanished. That sounds terrifying. And honestly, it was enough to get people's attention. The article suggested that the stretch of ocean between Florida and Bermuda might be unusually dangerous. But there was one big problem. It never actually explained why. There was no proven force, no scientific pattern, no clear connection between the cases, just a list of disappearances and an unanswered question. But sometimes, an unanswered question is all a legend needs. 2 years later, a magazine focused on paranormal stories took the idea even further. It drew a triangle between Florida, Puerto Rico, and Bermuda. That shape would eventually become famous around the world. But the writer never explained why those 3 locations were chosen. There was no study behind it, no official map, no data showing that accidents happened more often inside that exact area. The triangle was basically drawn first and justified later. Then came 1964. A fiction magazine called Argosy published an article using the name Bermuda Triangle. The story covered many of the same disappearances, but this time the details were more dramatic. There were invented quotes, dark warnings, frightening theories. It made the mystery feel bigger than it really was. And that makes sense when you remember what kind of magazine Argosy was. It wasn't trying to publish a careful scientific investigation. It was trying to entertain readers. Mystery sold magazines. Fear kept people reading. And once the name Bermuda Triangle entered popular culture, it became almost impossible to separate the facts from the story built around them. That's the key point. The Bermuda Triangle was not discovered by scientists studying an unusual part of the ocean. It was slowly created by newspaper articles, paranormal magazines, and fiction writers who knew that a strange disappearance made a powerful story. That doesn't mean the people or vehicles never disappeared. Those tragedies were real. But the larger idea, connecting all of them, may have been created afterward. And there's a useful lesson here. Whenever you hear a shocking claim repeated again and again, go back to the first source. Ask where the story started. Ask what evidence existed before the headlines, documentaries, and dramatic theories were added. Because repetition can make a claim feel true, but it can't prove it. When people talk about the Bermuda Triangle, they often go all the way back to Christopher Columbus. You'll hear the same 3 stories over and over. First, his crew supposedly watched a strange ball of fire fall into the ocean. Second, their compasses stopped pointing where they were supposed to. And third, they saw a mysterious light floating over the water. At first, that sounds like the beginning of every supernatural story you've ever heard. But once you slow down and look at the details, things become a lot less mysterious. Let's start with the fire in the sky. Columbus described it as something like a burning branch falling into the sea. That sounds dramatic, but it also sounds a lot like a meteor. His voyage took place in September, which happens to be one of the best times of the year to see shooting stars. So the first mystery may have been nothing more than a natural event that people simply didn't understand at the time. The compass story is similar. The crew noticed that the compass didn't line up perfectly with the North Star. Back then, that was confusing. Today, we know exactly why it happens. A compass points toward magnetic north. The North Star marks true north. Those aren't the same thing, and the difference is called magnetic declination. It's a normal part of how our planet works. Here's something that almost never gets mentioned. Neither the fireball nor the compass observation happened anywhere near what we now call the Bermuda Triangle. They happened much farther out in the North Atlantic. That detail alone changes the whole conversation. Then there's the strange light. Unlike the first 2 events, this one did happen closer to the area people later labeled as the Bermuda Triangle. But Columbus never described it as some impossible or supernatural object. In fact, he believed it might be a sign that land was nearby. And just a few hours later, his crew actually spotted land. That makes his guess look pretty reasonable. The light could have been a torch, a campfire, or another light coming from people already living on the nearby shoreline. Nothing in his journal says he thought it was magic. That's really the lesson here. A normal event can sound mysterious when you remove it from its original context. Leave out where it happened. Leave out what people knew at the time. Leave out what happened next. Suddenly, an ordinary story starts sounding like an unsolved mystery. So, whenever you hear one of these famous stories, ask yourself one simple question. Did this event really happen where people claim it did? Or was it added later because it made the legend more interesting? Sometimes the biggest mystery isn't what happened. It's how the story changed over time. If there's one case that made the Bermuda Triangle famous, it's Flight 19. Even today, it's probably the first story people think of when they hear those two words. The basic version sounds almost unbelievable. On the 5th of December 1945, 5 Navy planes took off from Fort Lauderdale for what was supposed to be a routine navigation training flight. Everything seemed normal. Then the planes disappeared. No survivors, no wreckage, no clear answers. Over the years, people turned that story into something much bigger. You'll often hear that all 5 aircraft were flown by experienced pilots and that every compass suddenly stopped working. But when you look at the actual records, the story becomes a lot more complicated. There were 5 airplanes, but not 5 veteran pilots. 4 of the pilots were students. Only one man had real authority over the group. His name was Charles Taylor, and he was the flight instructor. What's interesting is that Taylor wasn't leading the formation at first. One of the students was. Taylor was simply there to supervise the exercise. That changed after they reached the area around Grand Bahama. Taylor became convinced the student had taken the group in the wrong direction, so he took command of the flight himself. From that point on, everything slowly started to fall apart. The radio recordings tell a very different story from the legend. Taylor repeatedly said he believed they were over the Florida Keys, but based on the flight path and everything investigators later pieced together, they were most likely flying over the Bahamas. That one mistake changed everything. Taylor looked out the window, saw scattered islands below, and convinced himself they were the Florida Keys. Once he believed that, he stopped trusting his instruments. He reported that his compasses weren't helping him, but there's very little evidence that both compasses actually failed at the same time. It's much more likely that the instruments were giving the correct information. The problem was that the information didn't match what Taylor believed he was seeing, and that's where this story becomes so human. Before this assignment, Taylor had spent years flying around Miami and Key West. Most of his training missions happened over the Florida Keys. Those islands were familiar to him. So when he saw another chain of small islands in the Bahamas, his brain naturally matched them to the map he already knew. Instead of questioning his assumption, he questioned his instruments. There's another small detail that says a lot. During the radio calls, Taylor accidentally identified himself as MT-28, using the code for Miami. His correct call sign should have been FT-28 for Fort Lauderdale. It sounds like a tiny mistake, but it suggests that his mind was still thinking about Miami and the Florida Keys instead of where he actually was. That's an easy mistake to judge from the outside. But honestly, it's something almost anyone can understand. We've all been so sure we were right that we ignored the evidence sitting right in front of us. That's why Flight 19 is so fascinating. It may not have been a story about mysterious forces at all. It may have been a story about how experience can sometimes work against you. When what you believe becomes stronger than what your instruments are telling you, even years of experience can't guarantee you'll make the right decision. Once Charles Taylor became convinced they were flying over the Florida Keys, every decision that followed was based on that belief. And that's where things took a tragic turn. Thinking they were over the Keys, Taylor ordered the group to fly north to find the mainland. It sounded like the right move, but if they were actually over the Bahamas, flying north did the exact opposite. Instead of getting closer to Florida, they were moving farther out into the Atlantic. Some of the student pilots weren't convinced. According to the radio logs, a few believed they should simply turn west. If they had done that, there's a good chance they would have reached the Florida coast. But from Taylor's point of view, turning west didn't make sense. He believed it would take them into the Gulf of Mexico because he was already convinced they were somewhere over the Florida Keys. That's what makes this story so heartbreaking. The problem wasn't that nobody had an idea. The problem was that everyone was working from the wrong map. While they debated which way to go, the situation kept getting worse. The weather slowly began to change. The sun was getting lower. Visibility dropped. The ocean became rougher. And the fuel gauges kept moving closer to empty. Every minute mattered. Taylor eventually gave one final instruction. Stay close together. If one airplane dropped to 10 gallons of fuel, they would all ditch in the water at the same time. That decision tells you everything about how serious the situation had become. They weren't trying to complete a training mission anymore. They were simply trying to survive. The final radio messages are hard to listen to. You can hear the uncertainty. You can hear the exhaustion. At one point, they admitted they might have to land on the ocean at any moment. By then, there weren't many options left. The most reasonable explanation is also the simplest one. The planes eventually ran out of fuel. They were forced to ditch in rough water. Heavy military aircraft don't stay afloat for long, especially in open seas. Within minutes, they likely disappeared beneath the waves. No mystery. Just a chain of small decisions that slowly turned into a disaster. And honestly, that's the hardest part of this story. Experience doesn't always protect you from making mistakes. Sometimes it does the opposite. The more experience we have, the easier it is to trust what we've seen before instead of what the evidence is telling us right now. Taylor wasn't careless. He wasn't reckless. He was relying on years of experience. But in this case, that experience may have convinced him to reject the very information that could have brought everyone home. Sometimes the biggest danger isn't a broken compass. It's becoming so certain you're right that you stop listening to the facts in front of you. As if losing Flight 19 wasn't tragic enough, the story took another shocking turn. The Navy quickly launched a rescue aircraft called ST-49 to search for the missing planes. It took off like any normal mission. A routine radio message confirmed everything looked fine. Then, it disappeared too. For a lot of people, this became the moment the Bermuda Triangle turned from a strange story into something truly terrifying. Think about it. The rescue plane goes looking for 5 missing aircraft and then vanishes itself. It almost sounds impossible. But once again, the details tell a different story. About 23 minutes after ST-49 took off, a nearby ship reported seeing a large aircraft catch fire before crashing into the ocean. The explosion was impossible to miss. Flames shot high into the air and kept burning for several minutes. By the time the ship reached the area, the crew found floating debris and a large patch of oil. Around the same time, another vessel tracking aircraft by radar watched one suddenly disappear from the screen. The timing matched almost perfectly. Those reports point to something very different from a mysterious disappearance. They point to a crash. There's another important detail that often gets left out. The day before the mission, ST-49 had experienced engine trouble. The aircraft had even required an inspection after the incident. That doesn't prove the engine caused the crash, but it does give investigators a reasonable place to start. When you put all the pieces together, the most likely explanation isn't that the same unknown force swallowed both Flight 19 and the rescue aircraft. It's that ST-49 suffered a serious mechanical failure, a fire, an explosion, or another technical problem that caused the aircraft to go down before anyone had a chance to react. Sometimes 2 tragedies happen close together. That doesn't automatically mean they're connected. It's human nature to look for one big explanation that ties everything together. Our brains like patterns. They like simple answers. But real life usually isn't that neat. Flight 19 and ST-49 disappeared within hours of each other, but that doesn't mean they shared the same cause. One likely involved navigation errors and fuel exhaustion. The other may have ended because of a mechanical failure. Different situations, different evidence, different conclusions. And that's an important lesson whenever we look at famous mysteries. Just because 2 events happen close together doesn't mean they're part of the same story. Sometimes they're simply 2 separate tragedies that history chose to place side by side. And once people started calling it the Bermuda Triangle, It became easy to connect every accident into one giant mystery even when the evidence suggested otherwise. Not every story connected to the Bermuda Triangle has a simple explanation. Some cases are still open questions. Two of the best examples are Star Ariel and Star Tiger. Let's start with Star Ariel. In January 1949, the aircraft left Bermuda on a routine flight to Jamaica. At first, everything seemed completely normal. The weather was clear. The crew was experienced. The aircraft reported no mechanical problems. There was no distress call. Then, without any warning, it simply disappeared. No wreckage was ever found. No survivors. No clear evidence showing what actually happened. A year earlier, another aircraft from the same airline had disappeared under similar circumstances. Its name was Star Tiger. Unlike Star Ariel, the weather that day wasn't good. Strong winds had pushed the airplane off its planned route before contact was lost. After that, it vanished as well. Investigators worked through every piece of evidence they had. In the end, they reached a frustrating conclusion. They couldn't determine exactly what had happened, and that's an important detail. Unknown doesn't mean supernatural. Those two words are not the same thing. Sometimes investigators simply don't have enough evidence to reach a final answer. That happens more often than people realize, especially over the open ocean. There's another detail that's easy to overlook. The investigation into Star Tiger found that the aircraft hadn't been maintained as well as it should have been. Some known mechanical problems had never been fully repaired. Engineers also discovered that this model had a cabin heating system with a history of problems. If hydraulic fluid leaked onto a hot heater, it could start a fire or even trigger an explosion. No one can say with certainty that's what happened. There isn't enough evidence for that. But it's a real possibility based on the aircraft's design and maintenance history. And that's very different from claiming an invisible force pulled the plane out of the sky. Sometimes the hardest answer to accept is, we don't know. People naturally want certainty. We want every mystery to have a clear ending. But real investigations don't always work that way. Missing evidence doesn't automatically point to aliens. It doesn't prove secret portals, strange energy fields, or supernatural forces. It simply means the truth was lost before investigators could recover it. That's the biggest lesson from these two flights. An unsolved case is still just an unsolved case. Until real evidence says otherwise, it's more honest to admit what we don't know than to fill the gaps with stories that only sound exciting. Sometimes the mystery isn't created by what happened. It's created by everything that was never found. Some Bermuda Triangle stories involve airplanes. Others involve ships that seem even harder to explain. One of the strangest is the Carroll A. Deering. In early 1921, the five-masted sailing ship ran aground off the coast of North Carolina. From a distance, nothing looked unusual. The ship was still there. It hadn't sunk. But when Coast Guard crews finally boarded it, they found something far more disturbing. The entire crew was gone. All 11 sailors had disappeared. The two lifeboats were missing. The ship's log was gone. Personal belongings had vanished. Important navigation equipment had disappeared. Even both anchors were missing. On top of that, parts of the steering equipment looked like they had been smashed on purpose. It didn't look like a normal accident. It looked like something had happened before the ship was abandoned. Not long afterward, another twist appeared. A message in a bottle claimed the Deering had been attacked by pirates and that the crew had been taken away in handcuffs. For a while, people believed it. It sounded like the missing piece of the puzzle. Then handwriting experts examined the note. They discovered the man who claimed to have found the bottle had actually written the message himself. The entire thing was a hoax. So that explanation disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Even so, investigators didn't rule out foul play. There was real evidence suggesting the crew may have mutinied. The relationship between the captain and his first mate had become increasingly hostile before the voyage. The first mate had even threatened the captain, saying he would get him before the trip was over. Although the captain later forgave him, the tension never completely went away. Then there was another strange detail. Witnesses saw a large black steamship following behind the Deering. When they tried to identify it, the crew covered the ship's name and sailed away without responding. That's certainly suspicious, but suspicion isn't proof. No investigation ever found enough evidence to confirm piracy, mutiny, or any other single explanation. The truth simply remains unknown. And here's the part that often gets ignored. The Carol A. Deering actually made it safely through the area we now call the Bermuda Triangle. It wasn't until after leaving that region that the ship was found abandoned. That raises an obvious question. If the accident happened outside the triangle, why is it so often included as one of its greatest mysteries? The answer may be simpler than people expect. Once the Bermuda Triangle became famous, almost any strange disappearance in the Western Atlantic was eventually pulled into the story. Sometimes the legend grew faster than the evidence, and that's worth remembering. A mystery doesn't become stronger just because more unrelated cases are added to it. If anything, that only makes it harder to separate the facts from the story people want to believe. After looking at all these cases, one question kept coming back to me. Where is the Bermuda Triangle exactly? It sounds like an easy question, but the more you dig into it, the harder it becomes to answer. There isn't one official boundary that everyone agrees on. Some disappearances happened inside the triangle. Some only passed through it during part of their journey. Others happened in the Gulf of Mexico. Some took place completely outside the area, and in a few cases, ships actually crossed the entire Bermuda Triangle without any problems, only to disappear later somewhere else. That makes you stop and think. If a ship vanishes outside the triangle, why is it still called a Bermuda Triangle mystery? The answer usually goes something like this. It's close enough. Supporters often describe those places as adjacent areas. But here's the problem. No one ever explains where those adjacent areas end. How far is close enough? Does it include the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, the coast of Brazil, Nova Scotia? At some point, the triangle becomes so large that it almost stops being a triangle at all. And if the boundaries keep changing, it's hard to test whether the idea is actually true. There's another side to this that often gets overlooked. The region is one of the busiest stretches of ocean in the world. Thousands of ships and airplanes pass through it every year. More traffic naturally means more accidents. The weather doesn't make things any easier. Hurricanes and powerful storms move through the area on a regular basis. Conditions can change incredibly fast, even for experienced pilots and sailors. Then, there's the Gulf Stream. It's one of the strongest ocean currents on Earth. If a plane crashes or a ship sinks, that current can scatter debris over huge distances in a very short time. Sometimes it can carry wreckage so far away that finding it becomes almost impossible. When you combine heavy traffic, dangerous weather, and powerful ocean currents, you already have a pretty reasonable explanation for why so many accidents have happened there. You don't need an invisible force to understand why the area has earned its reputation. And honestly, that's where this story becomes the most interesting. The disappearances themselves are real. The people who were lost were real. The tragedies were real. But that doesn't automatically mean they all share one mysterious cause. Sometimes a place gains a reputation simply because enough stories get attached to it over time. The Bermuda Triangle may be famous for its mysteries, but the biggest mystery might not be what's hiding beneath the ocean. It might be why we're so quick to connect completely different accidents into one legend, even when the evidence points in different directions. That's a good reminder for all of us. A pattern isn't always proof, and just because several tragedies happened in the same general part of the world doesn't mean they were caused by the same thing. After looking at every case, one thing became impossible to ignore. There isn't one clear pattern connecting all the disappearances linked to the Bermuda Triangle. Some happened during violent storms. Others happened under clear skies. Some aircraft ran out of fuel. Some ships may have experienced mutiny. Others likely suffered mechanical failures. Sometimes investigators found wreckage. Sometimes they found nothing at all. The ships were different. The airplanes were different. They varied in size, age, speed, direction, altitude, and even the number of people on board. The more you compare these cases, the less they look like pieces of one giant puzzle. The only thing they really have in common is that someone decided to place them under the same name. And honestly, that might be the biggest mystery of all. Maybe the real question isn't why one part of the ocean can supposedly make people disappear. Maybe it's why we're so willing to believe that it can. The truth is, simple explanations usually aren't very exciting. A navigation mistake, bad weather, an engine fire, powerful ocean currents. Those answers don't capture people's imagination the way aliens, secret portals, or supernatural forces do. But reality doesn't exist to entertain us. It only exists to tell us what actually happened. And sometimes, the truth is far more ordinary than the stories built around it. To me, that's what makes the Bermuda Triangle so fascinating. Not because it proves something mysterious is hiding beneath the ocean, but because it shows how easily a compelling story can grow stronger than the evidence itself. The more a story gets repeated, the more it starts to feel like a fact even when the facts don't fully support it. That's a lesson that goes far beyond the Bermuda Triangle. It's a reminder to question what we hear, to look at the original evidence, and to stay curious without jumping to conclusions. If you enjoy exploring famous mysteries through real documents, historical records, and the details that most people overlook, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and I'd really like to hear what you think. After seeing all the evidence, do you believe the Bermuda Triangle is still an unsolved mystery? Or do you think it's simply one of the greatest legends ever told? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.